The Pine Tree Riot of 1772 was a pivotal yet often overlooked event in American colonial history that foreshadowed the revolutionary spirit that would soon ignite in the American Revolution. Occurring in the New Hampshire town of Weare, the Pine Tree Riot was a direct response to British restrictions on the logging industry, specifically the Crown's claim over white pine trees for use in Royal Navy ships' masts. This act of defiance marked one of the earliest organized colonial rebellions against British authority and set the stage for widespread revolutionary sentiment that would soon engulf the colonies. The roots of the Pine Tree Riot lay in British maritime policies and the exploitation of colonial resources. During the early 18th century, the British Royal Navy depended heavily on high-quality white pine timber for ship masts, critical to maintaining naval dominance. To secure this resource, the British government passed a series of laws starting with the Mast Preservation Clause in the Massachusetts Charter of 1691 and later the Broad Arrow Act of 1711. These laws reserved the tallest and straightest white pines in the colonies for the Crown. Trees exceeding 12 inches in diameter were marked with a broad arrow symbol signifying they could not be harvested without royal permission. This exclusive claim over natural resources by a distant monarchy was deeply resented by the colonists. This regulation disproportionately affected timber-rich colonies like New Hampshire, where the logging industry was vital to the local economy. Timber merchants, sawmill operators, and farmers found these laws restrictive and burdensome. They were required to pay fees and obtain licenses to cut and process large white pines, limiting their profits and livelihoods. Enforcement of these laws was often arbitrary and corrupt, with Crown-appointed surveyors wielding significant power over local industries. These officials often abused their authority, accepting bribes or favoring loyalists, which further fueled local resentment. By the 1760s and early 1770s, tensions between colonial loggers and British authorities had reached a boiling point. Local mill owners and loggers in New Hampshire openly defied the Crown's regulations, continuing to harvest and process pine trees without licenses. John Wentworth, the royal governor of New Hampshire, appointed John Sherburne as Surveyor General to enforce these laws more strictly. Sherburne's aggressive crackdowns on illegal logging inflamed local resentment. His deputies frequently inspected sawmills and levied hefty fines on violators, increasing economic pressure on small business owners. The situation escalated in 1771 when Sherburne fined several mill owners in Weare, New Hampshire for processing marked pine trees without permits. Benjamin Whiting, the Crown's deputy surveyor, and his deputy John Quigley were tasked with collecting the fines. On April 13, 1772, Whiting and Quigley traveled to Weare to confront the offenders. However, the locals, led by Ebenezer Mudgett, a prominent mill owner, resisted. Mudgett and his men confronted the officials, beating them with clubs and switches and forced them to flee the town. They also mutilated Whiting's horse as a warning. This act of rebellion was not spontaneous, but planned, illustrating the community's collective frustration and organized resistance. This act of violent defiance was one of the earliest examples of colonial resistance to British law. The perpetrators were eventually arrested and brought to court in Amherst, New Hampshire. However, the colonial jury was sympathetic to the rioters, resulting in relatively light fines and no severe punishment. This leniency demonstrated the growing solidarity among colonists against British authority and emboldened further acts of rebellion. Many local citizens viewed the rioters as defenders of economic freedom rather than criminals. The Pine Tree Riot highlighted the deepening divide between colonial economic interests and British imperial policies. For many colonists, British laws were seen as exploitative and unjust, prioritizing the Crown's needs over local welfare. The riot underscored the willingness of ordinary citizens to challenge British rule when their livelihoods were threatened. It reflected a larger pattern of colonial frustration with British economic policies, including the Navigations Act and various taxes imposed without colonial representation. In a broader context, the Pine Tree Riot contributed to the revolutionary fervor spreading throughout the colonies. Similar acts of resistance, such as the Boston Tea Party in 1773, would soon follow. The riot not only reflected economic grievances, but also symbolized a growing demand for self-governance and economic independence. The Crown's inability to suppress these localized uprisings revealed the limits of British control in the colonies and foreshadowed the organized rebellion that would culminate in the American Revolution. The legacy of the Pine Tree Riot is significant. Though overshadowed by larger revolutionary events, it represents an essential step in the colony's journey toward independence. It demonstrated that organized grassroots resistance could successfully challenge British authority and inspire future rebellion. The riot's symbolism also endured. with the pine tree becoming a symbol of colonial defiance. It appeared on early revolutionary flags, such as the Massachusetts Navy flag, emphasizing the colony's resistance to British rule. The imagery of the pine tree was a direct challenge to British control and celebrated the natural resources that the colonists felt were rightfully theirs. The Pine Tree Riot also had a ripple effect on British colonial policy. The Crown recognized the growing unrest and sought to tighten control over the colonies through stricter enforcement of trade regulations and harsher penalties for resistance. However, these measures only deepened colonial resentment. The riot demonstrated that the colonies were no longer willing to passively accept British exploitation and foreshadowed the more coordinated and large-scale acts of defiance that would define the Revolutionary period. In conclusion, the Pine Tree Riot of 1772 was more than a local dispute over timber rights. It was an early manifestation of colonial opposition to British oppression. By standing up against unjust regulations, the participants of the Pine Tree Riot set a precedent for the widespread revolutionary action that would erupt just a few years later. This act of defiance not only protected the economic interests of the New Hampshire's timber industry, but also signaled the colony's growing desire for autonomy and self-determination, ultimately contributing to the path toward American independence. The Pine Tree Riot serves as a reminder that American Revolution was built not only on grand political ideals, but also on the determination of ordinary people to defend their livelihoods and challenge unjust authority.